Well, I don't have much money, and I don't have much time, and I don't have many friends I could call mine. And I've been deceived, yeah, but haven't we all? I've seen the sun rise, and I've seen the sun fall. Well, I don't know why, and I don't know where, and I don't even know how, and I no longer care. But I've seen your face, and I've heard your call. Yes, I've seen the sun rise, and I've seen the sun fall. Let it go.
Hello and welcome to another SDA Q&A. I'm your host today, Peter Dixon, and my very special guest is Gillian Ford. How are you, Gillian?
I'm fine, thank you. Better than I've been.
Yes, you were a bit run down there with a bad cold. And
Yeah.
I was too. Both our voices sound a little bit sinusy, don't they? But we're on the mend. So it's great to have you here today. Welcome those that are watching. And once again, sorry for the short delay. I know there's a lot of people joining from all around the world live. Please think of questions that you might like to ask Gillian towards the end of our interview today. We'd love you to contribute and dig into some of the things we're going to be talking about by asking Gillian to expand on certain things if you'd like. So think of them now, but maybe keep those kind of questions until later. Now, Gillian, before we kick off, big congratulations on these 2 volumes. We've got On the Way to Glacier View, Desmond and Gillian, Volume 1 and Volume 2. And here's some of the contributors that you've had: John Rosier, Milton Hook, Raymond Cottrell, Glenn Hansen. Raymond, of course, is passed on, but you've got material from him via letters and other sources. And is Glenn Hansen passed on, or is he still with us?
No, he's living in China.
Right. Actually, I remember chatting with you about him once and saying, wouldn't it be good to have him on the show? That's right. Look, these are 2 fantastic books, and we're going to come back to these. There's a Volume 3 in the works, but with no date for release just yet. We're going to come to why you wrote these later. And we're today going to be, and I'm also going to be holding up later your 2 other books you've been working on as well. And we're very much looking forward to unpacking a little bit about those too. And I've got an original copy of the manuscript that Des wrote for Glacier View I've got over here, which I'll show a little bit later also. That'd be a bit of a collector's item now, I think. So we're looking back on Glacier View, and we're going to talk about your memories and thoughts on it. And I wanted, and I've chatted with you about this already, to get permission to play a clip of you talking to Des or asking Des some questions about Glacier View, kind of a big picture of it, what led up to it, some thoughts on it, his thoughts on the actual event, because we were going to chat about that anyway, and we were probably going to spend about 20 minutes looking into that just to give people who have not heard about Glacier View a bit of a background. But this explains it quite clearly in Des and your own words. And I think what we're going to do is just play that right now to give people a background on Glacier View. We're going to enjoy hearing your and Des's voice. Do you remember when this clip would have been made? It's not that long ago, maybe 5 years ago, was it? I'm not sure.
I think most of those were made in 2017.
Right.
About then.
So what we're going to do is play that entire clip. It's going to give everyone a wonderful background on Glacier View. And this interview then will have all the kind of things we want to have well represented in the one place. So let me press the right buttons. Hopefully I've got it right. And this is Des and Gillian, basically a short Q&A. So bear with me as I bring it up. I think here we go.
What was your background about the investigative judgment before the talk at PUC?
I had read the Bible through by the age of 12 and kept reading it in the months and years that followed, but found there was nothing in either Testament about the investigative judgment. But I was lent the book Great Controversy by Ellen G. White, and it influenced me greatly towards Adventism. I was an Anglican. It had much about the investigative judgment, and I did not realise that its content was largely from Uriah Smith and J.N. Andrews. I still regard that book as a spiritual classic, despite some historical mistakes and some theological errors. But its chapters on Luther and Huss and Jerome and Wesley are beautiful chapters. But it was the same year that in rereading Hebrews, particularly 6:19, 9:8, 9:12, 9:25, 10:19, I realised the Bible said that Christ went into the presence of God immediately on his ascension, not 1844. This was a problem to me. I loved the church. I was baptised when I was 16. So many good things in Adventism, which I still love. The Sabbath, which the Christian world has neglected, but which the New Testament proportionally mentions more times than the Old Testament. And Christ defended it by 7 miracles on the Holy Day. The Adventist teaching on the nature of man, so much better than hellfire. And there were other teachings, including the health message, which greatly appealed to me. But I was troubled when I found the book of Hebrews did not support the investigative judgment. And I spent 30 years trying to find a way out of that problem. I mentioned it to a number of people who were intelligent, who knew the Bible well, but the only one who had an answer was Pastor David Sibley, who was in charge of Trans-Tasman Union Conference. He says, it's wrong. But there are lots of good things in Adventism, so don't give up on it just because of that error. So, though I mentioned it to a number of folks, no one else had any other answer. And I was still a very loyal Adventist when I went to PUC about 1977.
What did Pastor David Sibley say to you about his contact with the teachings of W. Fletcher?
I travelled all night with Pastor David Sibley after he had baptised some folks that had accepted Adventism through my evangelistic meetings. And again I pressed him on the matter of the investigative judgment. He said the church appointed me in the 1930s to answer the main man who was against it in the Australasian division, a saintly man, a man whom everybody loved, by the name of W. Fletcher. I said, well, how did you get on? And Pastor Sibley said, I found he was right. I said, what? You, a president, you agree with Fletcher? Yes, said Sibley, he was right. But remember, there are many good things in Adventism, and every denomination has some problems. That was it.
Had you tried to talk to the top men in Adventism about the problem before you spoke at PUC?
I remember when Jill and I were in England and we met Elder Duncan-Eva, a wonderfully fine Christian man and a splendid administrator. I have met other good administrators like Robert Frame and Elsie Naden, the Hollingsworth brothers, and some fine men in the USA who were administrators. But Duncan-Eva was very special. And I talked to him about the problem in Hebrews. He rather represented the number of folk to whom I expressed my problem, but he had no answer. But I loved him.
You knew many of the chief SDA scholars. What was their attitude to the investigative judgment? For example, Fritz Guy and Fred Veltman.
Seventh-day Adventist scholars have known for almost a century the investigative judgment is not biblical. That's why it was not taught at Andrews, till I told Elder Wilson that no one there had heard about it for years. When Fritz Guy, teaching at Andrews, was asked about the investigative judgment, he said it is as true as the story of the man in the moon. In later years, I spoke to Fritz myself, and I said, isn't this doctrine actually ridiculous? He paused, and then he said slowly, yes, it is. Fred Veltman, for years, had known the investigative judgment was wrong. I think it was he who told this to Dale Ratzlaff long years before. And he approached Neil Wilson at the time of Glacier View and he said, I'm with Des. I do not believe the investigative judgment. Elder Wilson said, that's okay, but don't go public. Well, I'm mixed with a number of other scholars. I can only think of one or two still trying to hold on to investigative judgment. The rest of them had thrown it out. And the same is true of scholarly men in the Australasian division, whom I knew very well indeed.
Were you pleased that Glacier View took place?
I was very pleased that Glacier View took place. For 30 years, by voice and pen, I had tried to draw the attention of the church, a church I love deeply and still love. I tried to draw the attention of the church and failed. I was very glad about Glacier View. What I had discovered at 15 years of age, I was able to present to 1,000 people at the PUC forum. And then I was asked to write a document, and I wrote nearly 1,000 pages to try and cover all the traditional rebuttals, all of which I knew very well indeed. So I was pleased about Glacier View because my manuscript would now go all over the Adventist world. I was rather sorry to learn that most people at Glacier View didn't have time to read the manuscript, though they had been told, don't come unless you've read it. But Ray Cottle assured me that as he mixed with the people there, he hadn't found people who'd read it at all. But I was very pleased. Glacier View cost me my vocation as a Bible teacher, which I loved. I loved. I had prayed for it since I was 15, and God had led me to it. And I spent many years teaching at Avondale and about 2 years at PUC. Later I was to teach at Trinity Evangelical Seminary. So the loss of my vocation hurt. But after that, I went to many countries. Jill and I were in England, and I was in Ireland. Jill and I were in Norway, Sweden. I preached the gospel in many countries, including Russia and the places I have mentioned. And the main cities of America I went to repeatedly. I did not preach on the investigative judgment. I've taken thousands of meetings since Glacier View, literally thousands, but I have not ever chosen to speak on investigative judgment unless specially urged by some group, which has happened 3 or 4 times. It happened at Loma Linda and it happened in Sydney, but as a rule I don't speak on it at all. Yes, I'm very glad about Glacier View. The investigative judgment is now dead. A GC friend who made arrangements to see me when he came over this country, he said, we don't preach it over there anymore. There are a few extremely traditional people trying to hold on to it, but people that read, people that study the Bible have given it up. We thank God for that, because now those who are untrammeled by this non-biblical teaching can have Christian assurance. They can know they're right with God, that they've got the verdict of the last judgment today. Read 1 John, it says it over and over. We know we are the children of God. Adventists can now know, because the obstacle, the terrible obstacle of the investigative judgment, which was the 5th invention of the church to try and explain 1844, it's now dead.
Talk about your interaction with Neil Wilson at the meetings and...
Pastor Neil Wilson, Elder Wilson, was a very gifted, talented, intelligent man. He could be very kind, friendly, charming, but he was first of all an administrator. Coincidentally, yesterday I read a famous book written by Dr. Marcus Dodds on the parables. And I happened to read yesterday, he said there's a great danger for men in the position of the church that's high and lofty, that they can begin to run the church like a business. And Dodd spoke at length about it. And I have to confess that Neil Wilson faced that temptation. Whether he fully succumbed to it, only God knows. He was very gifted. I've heard him speak at considerable length and say nothing. That's very difficult to do. But he was a man that could make friends easily and lose them easily. At the time of the Davenport scandal, top men wept before Wilson. You know, all power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I'm not Wilson's judge. He spoke to me very strongly and very unkindly in front of the whole group of the Glacier View people. One well-known scholar went out of the hall weeping, and other scholars felt like that. His last years he suffered from dementia, but so do many saints. I commit him to God, and I'm pleased that he called for Glacier View. He could have said, Des, you go back to canvassing. I was a colporteur in the 1950s. I wouldn't have missed it for $1,000, and I wouldn't go through it again for $1 million. But he could have said, Des, we're throwing a blanket over this. You've made an administrative error in telling the children about this matter. Back you go to canvassing. But he didn't. He called a worldwide gathering. And so now the topic is well nigh dead.
What was your main concern about the Friday afternoon meeting with Prexad and others? What was not recorded in their notes?
It is my opinion, having heard Jill's talks about the Friday afternoon, it is my opinion that many things I said were never recorded. But that's not my main problem. There were men there I trusted implicitly. Arthur Duffy, you wouldn't find a better man than Arthur Duffy. Duncan Eva was there. Spangler was my friend, though he was a company man. But my main objection was these men were finding fault with a manuscript they'd not read, a manuscript that had been supported in its key areas by the consensus statement, which they buried. They never brought it up on the Friday afternoon. It's never been brought up since, because it agreed with my manuscript in 12 key areas. So my main concern on the Friday afternoon, here were men who probably had never given 30 minutes to the problems associated with Daniel 8:14, and they were judging me who'd given 30 years of minute and thorough attention to the problem, trying to find a way out for the church. And I did find a way out, and I mentioned it at the close of my PUC forum meeting. You know, that's now in a little book that you can get from Amazon, and you'll see I gave the church a way out. But these men on Friday afternoon, some of them saints, but ignorant saints. That was a sorrow to me. This little book will be of interest to some of you. It gives a word-for-word transcript of the talk I gave at the PUC forum. And there are some interesting comments also from Dr. Ray Cottrell, who in his day was the best scholar Adventism had. The book can be gotten from Amazon, quite inexpensive.
Des, among the things that they said on the Friday afternoon meeting at the beginning, they made you out to be a very bad boy indeed. And they said through the meeting at times, they kept on saying how you had taken things out of context.
Oh, I'll be glad to talk about that.
Talk to us about the pre-meetings of Glacier View with that.
One of the 10 points used against me, the key to my expulsion, was that in my manuscript I'd taken some quotations out of context. This was the belief of Arthur Furch, or at least he expressed it, but he was never able to give me an example, and no one ever has. There is nothing out of context in that very large book, which summarised 30 years of research, including research at the Library of Congress in USA. On that Friday afternoon, the brethren repeatedly accused me of a number of things that they had heard as rumours and were not true. Parmenter had told them that I was in collusion with Bob Brinsmead. That was never true. It is true Bob tried to get me on his side after Glacier View, but I refused. I was accused of quoting out of context. No one has ever been able to demonstrate that accusation. Now, of course, I'm a long way from being a perfect saint, and I'm quite sure that there are times when my selfish spirit has failed to speak in a perfect Christian manner. But this I can say, I've taken about 30,000 talks, 30,000, including classes, radio, television, sermons, and the main objective in every one of those talks was to bring people to the gospel of Christ. That I can confess, though I am indeed a very faulty individual.
Have well-known scholars in Australia spoken of their opinions on this issue? Didn't two people do a PhD on the topic?
Yes, Australian scholars in teaching, I don't know how much in preaching, but in teaching, have admitted the problems found in Hebrews chapter 6, chapter 9 and chapter 10, which clearly state Christ went within the second veil, into the Holy of Holies, into the presence of God at his ascension, not 1844. Two of those men have done their PhD dissertations on this subject. I have those dissertations, though one of them, among 7,000 books, may be difficult to find. The other I could put my hand on immediately. And I know of scholars now who are important in the Australasian division who know and confess that we were altogether wrong about 1844. I could name them, but I don't think that would be a Christian thing to do.
How has your life been since Glacier View? Have you lost many friends?
I thank God for his mercies. I'm not aware of losing any real friends. And Jill and I have friends all over the world. You have to remember I've been in over 40 countries, and in all those countries, or in most of them, there's someone I've taught somewhere along the way. So by the mercy of God, Jill and I have not lost real friends, and we have an innumerable company of friends today. My life since Glacier View has been very, very busy, perhaps too busy, a risk to health. But I've had excellent health till 2015. Excellent health until then, and then an accident from years earlier triggered surgical repairs and led to a stroke and to infection and to hospitalisation, and one doctor thought I was going to die. But I have comparatively good health despite a torn meniscus in the knee. There are many things which I would like to do better. I am a terrible writer because I write with the left hand, and it's not only left hand, it's backwards and it's bad. I'm a terrible writer. I'm not naturally tidy. If you visit me in my study, you'll see books and papers everywhere. I'm sure I don't love people as much as I should, but I do pray regularly that God will make me more like my Lord Jesus Christ. Since Glacier View, he has cared for Jill and me in a wonderful way. Americans wouldn't let us come back to Australia. They wanted to form Good News Unlimited. So hundreds of meetings were taken in America for those people, in all the big cities of America, over and over and over again. And then I spoke on 26 radio stations. I spoke on television for months. From time to time, I went to Trinity Evangelical Seminary and taught there. God has been very good to us. It's been a very full life. Jill has been such a helper. She's done many things I could not do. She's naturally very practical, whereas I'm bigger in theory than in practice. So I've had a good wife, a good life, and a Christ who is always near. I have everything to thank God for.
How did Neil Wilson and Robert Falkenberg treat you after Glacier View? I'm talking about the visits of the PUC clergy from time to time.
We had visitors, Jill and I, from PUC pastors from time to time, because Neil Wilson had put pressure on them to get rid of us from the church, which they refused to do. Ultimately, when we're coming back to Australia, we thought it was the honest thing to do to remove our membership from PUC. We did it despite requests from PUC people, don't do it. But we didn't think it was honest to keep our names on the roll there when we're going to be in Australia. Neil Wilson and probably Falkenberg. I don't know all that Falkenberg did, except he did a number of things that rendered him a very guilty man indeed. But we do know that Neil Wilson was led by Keith Parmenter to organise a meeting that would remove my credentials after 1983. Duncan Eva and Spangler told Jill and me that Parmenter had been pushing Neil Wilson to get rid of my credentials one way or another, and Neil Wilson did it. He had lots of ability.
I turned the mic off and I can't hear you.
How is
Hello.
that? I think I'm back again now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good.
There's
Because I turned my mic off. When I turned it back on, you were silent.
Oh, okay. Hey, that was incredible to watch back for many reasons. And the reason I shared
Yeah,
that
it's a bit-
video, and thanks for giving me permission, was because I think this is going to be a very important interview that encompasses a wide variety of material. That particular video really articulated well the lead up to and some of Des and your thoughts on it. So also it was in our feed that you and I can see, it turned that clip into one of the guests on the side, so it looked like the three of us were having an interview together, and that was quite a surreal feeling to watch that. So for those that are just joining us, yes, that gives everyone a bit of a background on Glacier View from the question and answer that Gillian and Des had before Des sadly left us and passed away.
It makes it
Go ahead.
makes it worthwhile having done all those videos, because I got the bright idea in 2017. Well, I could do videos as well, and I did about, I don't know whether it was 20 or 30 hours on the history of Glacier View, and I had the opportunity, transcripts, I wrote it all out because I wasn't used to doing this, and Des read it, corrected it, added, and then
Brilliant.
he decided to do 6 himself. So this is part of the background for me ending up doing the books. And then, of course, I won't be too long on this because you've got an agenda, but you did the 40th anniversary, and some of the people who came on, I'd say that nearly half of them were because I asked them.
Yeah.
Because I came on board. But there were people who were actually there. Interesting for me to hear what they thought of what happened, because a number of them really didn't have a clue of what had taken place. And then I had to, Des died, and I had to move and pack up the library with the help of friends, which was an unbelievable job. And there are about 100 pages of documents, and I pretty much sorted them all out, scanned them, because there was the uncertainty of whether the church would actually want Des's collection. We had it in our will, and this is sort of part of the talk, what to do with the collection. Glacier would have liked it, PUC. Subsequently, Andrew showed an interest, but I sort of felt, look, we willed it because Rosalie asked us to do it. And by rights, it should go to Avondale. So it was done quite discreetly. But I decided that I would copy all the important documents. So I spent about 2 years manually copying, because a lot of them were brittle, so they couldn't go through a feeder, but about 20,000 folders of documents. So, and I read a great deal about it, a lot of work on the history of Glacier View over the last few years. So that brings you sort of up to date.
Right. And we're going to come back to this. This is kind of the culmination of all of that work, these 2 volumes, and a part 3, volume 3 is in the works as well for down the track. No release date yet. So I want to lead into that and talk about, again, dig deep into the motivation of why you felt the need to kind of collate all these resources. I just, out of interest, I wanted to show people, this is the Des was talking there about the manuscript that was given out to everybody, and it was in 3 places, wasn't it, Gillian? I'm just holding it up there. That's the manuscript.
Well,
These are
you've
like,
got your books, and
yeah,
I've got mine.
we're showing all our books. Now that's
And these are
what
the
you
same
have
thing.
there. And what I'll get you to do later is put it into the links on our Facebook group. A lot of people are watching from YouTube as well today, but the links will be available over at our Facebook group, and in the description below, if you're watching YouTube, you can click that link and go there. And Gillian, so in the comments, just give links for people where people can buy these books as well. So what are you holding up there? That's the manuscript.
This is
put
the same
into,
as what you've got.
Yep.
It's done from Angus McPhee's version of Glacier View manuscript. I took it from the PDF, and he took it from those 3 volumes which were put out by the church. So I've done it in 3 volumes.
Yep.
And in each one it has the appendices for each volume. So I've done it exactly like that one. And I want you to note, I have many providences in doing all this work, things that just couldn't have happened. Very hard to find cover artwork. So, especially in commercial art. And I went in and I put in crossing the divide. And this came up, and it's got a picture of Des on it, crossing a glacier.
It's actually Des.
Pretty amazing. So anyway, these are on Amazon.
They're great.
And I might add, I've done a number of Des's books. I've redone Kaleidoscope, which is, no, this is Right with God. If you go onto Amazon and you look at Desmond Ford books, the list will come up. It goes on for pages, and other people's books come up. So you keep on going through. Did The Forgotten Day. I've actually done a lot. I've done a lot of work.
You have. Now, okay, so I've got a couple of books I want to go through. Look at that. We've got our great minds. Let's look at this one first, because the other one I've got a couple of things I want to say about. So this is a reworking of this great book, which is, it's like a biography by Milton Hook, isn't it? And that's a reworking, exactly available as hard copy and also online. And you've given me permission to do an audiobook, and I've actually approached someone to do the reading of it, and I can't wait to announce who it is, because it's someone that's very close to the heart of all of this material. So now, before we show the next one, so that's a great book that also talks about Glacier View.
Just a comment on this. This was pretty much out of print. Now, when I do these books, you know, I do them in InDesign. I was a graphic, sort of a designer. Books like this, I got a graphic artist to do the final. But Milton and I reread it. We went through it. It's after doing all this work on Glacier View, I'm absolutely amazed of Milton. He's really on the ball.
Yes.
And we did make some slight corrections, some things in the family history. But, and the other thing that's important on these books is I'd never done it in my life, but I did Kindles.
Right.
For this one, these were published in February. I did one for Deliverance. And this book, you know, the Black Daniel with the lion on it, the type was probably, at the most, it was 9. It was a small type of font and very hard for older people to read. And the footnotes were 6 or 7, the size of them, and that's very, very small. So it's now, that's why it's a 500-page book, because I did it in 12 points so that people will be able to read it. And so I did Kindles for both of these. The only problem is that taking things out of a PDF file, out of scanned stuff, it's very difficult to get all the footnotes working, so that normally when you go into a Kindle book, click on the footnote and it will go straight. But I'm afraid it would take more work to do that. When I've got nothing else to do, I might go back.
And
But
just
look,
on
before we forget
Yep.
it, if anybody has, I'm putting together Volume Blue. I never meant to do any of them, but if anybody has any interesting letters or documents that they think I would like to put in this new volume, if they could send them by email or messenger, I would really appreciate it, because, I've got what I've got, but I'm sure there's more stuff out there somewhere.
Yeah, that's
I'm done.
fantastic. So everyone, just make sure you do that. If you had material that's that could be of interest to Gillian for Volume 3 of her book series, this one here. I love that picture, by the way. It's fantastic.
Now, the
way to
symbolic,
Glacier.
we didn't have many professional photos. That's probably the only one, but that was done by Skip Baker, who was the Review and Herald photographer, and he was a gospel person, and he wanted to take that photograph, and it was taken in July 1980 in Washington, DC. So that's why it's on the cover.
Just before Glacier
I was 35. I was 51, and I know I was 35 because Luke told everybody he met, my mum's 35.
Now, this book that you held up earlier, some people, I've got some copies here. You've got copies. If people want to get a copy, just contact myself or Gillian. A lot of people have said, what was it from? What was the original cover? And that's this one. And I'm just showing these two so that people can have a reference point knowing what the two are. So
now, that book was published by the church. It's important to notice that book was published by the church. And essentially, this is before Glacier View. It took 5 years to get through the committee. There was a lot of resistance, and it probably contributed to Des going to Glacier View, because the old men in Australia were very, very opposed to it. And I actually wrote the foreword. It's actually an afterword in that book. That's one of the things that's in the new book as well, to sort of show the role that book played in getting Des to Glacier View. So it's Des's best view in the church, the one his students in 30s received. Des said that the hints of the future were in the footnotes, but he didn't really make up his mind about an investigative judgment until he wrote Crisis, his commentary on Revelation, which he actually wrote in 1979, just before the Forum meeting. And to do that, he went to the Library of Congress, and he was given a ticket to go in the back of the stacks, into the stacks, and he pretty much handled everything on Revelation. And he found that using historicism of interpretation all through the centuries, the church had read the book of Revelation like a newspaper. So in Luther's time, and John Rosier talks about this, in Luther's time, he saw the plagues in Europe as the last plagues, and he believed he was pushing the third angel's message. And Des came home and he said to me, in the 19th century, Adventists did the same, and they applied, the book of Revelation to their time. But what happens as time goes on, it becomes inappropriate. That was the big key to why Des, that was just before he did the forum meeting. And that, anyway, that's a bit of an explanation. So I haven't essentially edited that book, except in a couple of places where it's very clear it's edited, because I didn't think it was my role to go in and change Des's work. And Des's book, which I may get to do, I'm going to redo Crisis to match this one. I'm also going to redo Des's thesis. I've started work on jobs, very big jobs, and I might do Daniel and the Coming King, which was Des's post-Glacier view commentary on where he actually fixed it himself. So that's just to give you a bit of an overview. I hope that I'm not going too much off track.
No, that's fantastic. Fantastic. So, and there's the book that he held up in that little YouTube clip that we played just then, which is basically the transcript of the October 27, 1979 forum meeting, isn't it?
I can put that on Facebook, put the source for that, because I can't remember the title.
I'm going to write in the comments later a list of what I think are a wonderful wonderful resources that people can go through from basically a good starting point is this one, and then the forum one. We won't go through them now, but it's season 2 on Facebook with all the interviews, 86 interviews I think we did. As you said, I think you organised at least half of those, and thank you very much for that. I'm working on getting all of those up on YouTube as soon as I can as well. Let's come up to the present and this latest release. One of the interesting things that I think motivated you, and I'll get you to confirm this, is that recently, was it the Heritage Centre at Avondale, or officially owned or run by the SPD in this part of the world, was, what can we say, a lot of changes were made, and a lot of people who had given material to the Heritage Centre were a bit concerned about what might happen to the future of that material. I'd been asked to donate all of the season 2 complete interviews from without any edits, and I'm really glad I didn't, because I'm kind of not sure what they may have just languished in the archives there, and I think that you may have had some concerns. You'd given lots of material over the years. A lot of people have, and so in some ways this work, these volumes are you taking control of a lot of the material, resources, letters, bits and pieces taken from the last 42 years and even before, and putting them in one place. So this is becoming the replacement Heritage Centre archive. And so just confirm, if you like, what I've just said, and tell us how you got into this incredible project, which you have put together quite fast. I remember you talking about it, and then over a year or so it suddenly appeared.
Well, because I've been working in this area and writing stuff, working on articles, and then thinking of something else and doing another one, and so it's sort of all in my head, but the books weren't in my mind, working on those other 2, Milton and so on. Look, somebody's just asked if it's in Kindle, and the answer is no. It's too complicated, but at some point I will give GNU the PDFs, and people can download them. There's charts and all sorts of things.
And what I love too is you've got some of your material in there that was a bit difficult to get earlier as well. There's all sorts of fantastic resources and letters that, like you say, would be difficult to put up in a Kindle format, charts and bits and pieces.
And I did all the drawings.
Yeah, oh, wow. I love there's letters like AFJ Cran's letter to Des, August 17, 1958. Letter ML Andreessen to Des, January 4, 1957. It's just incredible. I'm nearly finished
There's
book
over
1.
that's volume 2. There's over
Yes, this is
200
volume 2.
pages of letters that go
Yeah,
from
it's just incredible.
until fairly recent, and I found some more. I've got there are all sorts of letters. A lot of them are Des replying to his enemies, and the thing, his attitude towards them, his courtesy.
Yeah.
You know, because
Very
the
gracious.
whole idea of these books was to show, number one, what they did to us. Could have called the books I Know What You Did, because as Cal Stewart and Rob Thompson said to me recently, well, we all knew that it was iffy, but you know, I can now document from their writings.
And I think what you may have been hoping in the past is that people would stumble across all of this material in the Heritage Centre and the various places that you've allowed people to kind of collate and store this information. But now with that appearing to not be being going to happen or unfold, you've put it all into one place. I'm like a pig in mud. I just love it.
So let's
You've
go.
got your inquiries progress in there as well, and all the key names. Letter from Keith Palmer to Des in 78.
He said you should put, you know, some of your stuff in there, because I did help get Des fired unintentionally, but he was quite happy about it. Anyway, the question you asked about why did I write the book?
Yes.
I told you the story about negotiating whether I should put the collection in the archives or not. So this was over 11,000 books and 100 pages of documents, and altogether I would have copied 50 pages of documents, which took me nearly 2 years. But the originals are at Avondale. Now, I called one of the previous division presidents, and I asked him on my behalf to talk to Glenn Townend about whether they wanted the collection. What's the good of sending it if they don't want it? And he actually didn't do that. He talked to somebody at Avondale, which was not the right thing. And because of what they said, I thought, once this gets out of my house, I have no say over it at all. So what we did was we wrote 2 legal contracts. One was written with the division, controls archives and Avondale archives. And the other one I wrote with Rose Lee, and whoever she was going to, she created a group that would look after the collection and make the decisions about it. And she would decide who was going to take her role when she left. So that's what we decided to do. And we thought, well, that's the best we can do. Well, I'm not going to go into it because people have been gotten rid of. How much is connected with Des's collection, I don't know. I don't want to be paranoid about it. But both of the people in the contract I made with Rose Lee were let go. And one of them, quite unfairly, accused, but somebody else might get fired if I start talking about it. But anyway, I had contact. I had a couple of articles, as you know, in Volume 2 by Ray Cottrell, and I thought I ought to ask his family if it's all right to publish it. And unfortunately, nobody's publishing Ray's stuff, which is really, really sad. So I asked Doug Hackelman, who's a friend, and he said to contact somebody at Andrews. And while I was talking to them, you know, there was an expression of interest in the collection. I said, "Oh, you can have it," because I said it might be safer with you. Anyway, that didn't happen, but I started to think to myself, is it really worth the expense of the church moving it over to its only books and paper, got the heart of it? And I thought, now what I can do, because I can make books and I can, you know, typeset them and just put them up on Amazon. Why don't I create an archive of Des's collection? So I went through it, and I really, because I've been through it several times and I'm going through it again, looking for more stuff, and I really have put the cream of the collection in those books. So that's why it happened. In February, it wasn't even in my mind. And then once I started doing it, I went like a fury, because the 42nd anniversary, and of course, 42 is the number of Antichrist, the beast, the tribulation, and the wandering in the wilderness. And I thought, the church has been wandering in the wilderness for 42 years. I've got to have it done. So I got it done by July. Now, I first put it up, and I hadn't had it proofed, but Kylie Berling came in and proofed it in an amazing speed. So what's up there now is proofed. Yeah, I don't know how it happened. And then, of course, I had the thought, I ended up deciding to do a summary of what happened from 1978, when Parmenter said Des was not going back to Avondale, a decision that was made 2 years before Glacier View, right through to 1983, when Des was actually declared apostate. Me too, and Smuts and Noel Mason as well. And that is when, and a lot of this stuff you've got to go pick it up, because when you're going through this, they don't tell you what's going on. You've got to sort of work it out, and it takes a great deal of work to go over things and suddenly click, oh, well, that's what happened. So that's when they approached PUC about a membership in 1983, and they did it ever after, because PUC, all the pastors resisted. You've got to say that's lovely. And I've even been told they'd have us back, because we were the ones in the end who pulled out. So the idea, the 1983 thing, do you want me to talk about that?
Yeah.
Just briefly. So, you know, Glacier View, Des, in the Friday afternoon meeting, they gave Des 4 conditions, that 2 of which he could not meet. One was about Danning Brinsmead in the review. Now, by the time the letters and the papers came out, all this stuff about Brinsmead was taken out. But it was, they were convinced that Des and I, although I never got mentioned, but I was supposed to be the intermediary, that Des was in cahoots with Brinsmead, and that they'd been sort of doing these things apart. You know, Bob had written his book on 1844 in summer of 1979, and then Des did his forum, and now there was Glacier View, and after that they were going to get together and destroy the church. And it was fiction, actually. It wasn't true at all. Bob will tell you the same. He said it never happened. But they really believed it. Where was I going with that? So that was the big thing. And the other thing was that Parmenter told Des, it's no good putting this in your pocket and not talking about it, because Des was willing to not talk about it. And he said, you have to say you were wrong, and preached traditional Adventism. And Des said, well, you could give me, they gave him 2 weeks to make his mind up. But he said, look, you could give me years. He said, I could never do it. Are you asking me to go against my conscience? And Parmenter said, no, we're not asking you to go against your conscience. It's the fundamentals. Then I shouldn't have to ask you for your credentials. You should hand them in. But Des never, he didn't resign. They ended up firing him. But what I found out, which will come out in volume 3, and mainly from the writings of Ken Eastman, I'll just touch on it briefly, is that before Glacier View, several members of the Australian Executive Division Committee, it would include Parmenter, got together and decided that they were going to defrock Des, whatever happened at Glacier View. Now, Ray Cottrell says this in one of the papers, one of the chapters that I put in volume 2. I'd never read it before. I suddenly came across it and it jumped out like that, where he said that Parmenter said this on the Thursday afternoon, that he'd been given a mandate to defrock Des, whatever happened at Glacier View. Now, Ray Cottrell was very meticulous, and he knew took shorthand notes of all the full assemblies. So that's one factor, pre-programmed. Now, he used the mandators from the Australasian Division Executive, but there was no meeting of the committee, and there were no notes taken. And the reason I know that is because the day I was going to put up volume 2, I got it ready, got the PDF ready. I was going to do it in the morning. I got a whole lot of documents of Des's. I get them occasionally. And there was only one of them in interest, and it was by Doug Eastman, who was the contract lawyer for the division. And in the letter, he's writing to Lloyd McMahon, who was another lawyer. They're both now deceased, unfortunately, but it means I can use the letter. And he's sent Lloyd a whole number of papers because he's worried that Des didn't get natural justice. And he talks about Len Moulds, who was moved out of Avondale in 1967, I think at Harvard, and pretty much lost his faith. And he was talking to the students about it. And the action actually came from Pearson. I'm saying more than I was going to say, but the division came up and he went through a committee, and Eastman compares what happened with Len Moulds to what happened to Des. And he said Des didn't get natural justice. And in that letter, which I did slip in, I found I had two pages, so I put it in. This is volume 2. They're saying they talked about, we asked Prexad to do it. Now, it's a bit veiled. He has to be careful. But I take it from this that the Australasian Division didn't want to fire Des. He was, even though he was working in America, he was an Australian employee. So they asked Prexad to do it. And to some degree, Wilson went along with it because we had there were 3 meetings with Prexad, one at Glacier View on the Friday afternoon. One, I think, on August the 26th, was I've just found a letter I wrote to mentioning the date and that Des was at this meeting. And then another one on the September the 2nd. And they stacked that meeting. They invited Ken Wood, Herb Douglas, and Arthur White, not the greatest of friends of Des's, and they made the decision to defrock Des. So then Neil Wilson, when it came to September the 15th, he sent a cassette to the Australasian Division executive who actually met, and he told them that they must defrock Des. It's completely illegal. And what these notes do is they actually document what we already knew, because both the GC lawyer, who was present at Glacier View, or was at GC at the time, I do know his name, and Ken Eastman told Des around the time of Glacier View that the whole thing was illegal and he had a case to sue. But he wouldn't do it, wasn't interested. Des would never sue the church. So that's part of it. So that's the thing going up to Glacier View and how it was done behind the scenes. So when you read the letters, which are actually pleasant, we were well treated, you've got to know what was happening behind the scenes. So then afterwards, sort of, do you want me to talk about this, just to tell you how it goes to 83? Okay.
Yeah.
This is what I've just been working on. I thought, until I'd finished the books, and then I went back to look at this section, that I first thought Des was going to be apostatized in about September 1982, when I think I got a phone call. I don't think it was a letter, from Eleanor Barrett. And Vernon Parmenter had come, was a great friend of theirs, and he'd come and said that his father had been to, I think it was full council, it could have been spring council that year, but the time, I'm not quite sure. But he said he was asking for Des's ordination and to be declared apostate. If that hadn't happened, if I hadn't heard from Eleanor, it's the only call I ever got from her, I wouldn't know any of this, because it's what made me look back at it. So then I asked somebody in Australia if they would check out whether it's true, and they said yes, it was. And almost immediately we got a call from Duncan Eva, and who Des mentioned. He was an intermediary. He was the vice president and a very good man, absolutely loved the gospel. And he called and said how Neil Wilson wanted to see if Des could come back into the church. And he talked to all the division presidents, and they said, no, we can't do that. And he said, yes, we must do it. So I've heard this other story, and I said, this is like Glacier View. I said, that's the front story. And I said, I've heard the back story. But of course, I didn't say who said it. And I talk more about this in the book, because anyway. But there was a history before that. And when I was going through the documents, there was a folder of that Calvin Edwards had put together. And I think I'd started work. And so I wasn't so involved with Good News at the time. And I just, a lot of the time I was just going on doing this and making bread, and I'd hear stuff, but I wasn't fully into it. So I went back and looked through all those documents, and it turned out that the Australasian Division had been in touch with Good News. In early 1982, all the Good News men, which included Smuts Van Roy and Noel Mason, Calvin Edwards, and Des, I'm not sure who else was there at the time, but we had 3 or 4 us. They took meetings in Australia, and of course, the Australasian Division didn't like this, because it involved a lot of people going out to hear Des. So I've gone, ultimately, I've put out the documents of what happened, but they shared documents. This is the church and Good News. And they asked them, they wanted to have these meetings to see if they could come back in. And they asked them not to go the following year, because anyway, So it was much bigger than I remembered. I had no memory of having any dealings with GC, and I don't fully understand it because I apparently went to a meeting in the July before I heard from Eleanor and was present in 12 hours of meetings at General Conference with people that I know quite well, but I've got absolutely no memory of it. I can't explain it. They say I was there, so I must have been. Anyway, so Duncan Eva came over and met with us, and then ultimately in the January there was a meeting in the Hilton, I think, somewhere at San Francisco, maybe near the and Bill Johnson was there, Spangler, Gerhard Hasel, Dick Glacier, who was the head of biblical, he was the vice president. Enoch Oliveira was there, he was another vice president. Did I mention Duncan Eva? Bob Spangler? Yeah. So there were about 7 of them. And Des said he wouldn't go without the Good News Men. So Smuts, Noel, Calvin were there, and I was there. Now, when they described the meeting, I'm not mentioned, but I was there. And anyway, the meetings didn't get very, saw that there wasn't any common ground. But the point of it all was they never really intended to bring Des back in. The intention was to get him out, but you've got the nice diplomatic way at the front, and then you've got the backstory. Now, you might think I'm making this up, but while I was looking on Google, I came across an article by Adrian Zukoski and Jim Londis, and in the, I think it's the June 1983 Spectrum, they both wrote articles about what had happened, particularly Adrian wrote. And he mentioned that in October 1982, the annual council had met in the Philippines, and one of their jobs was to rewrite the clause in the workers' policy of moral falls and apostasy. And it was written essentially to get rid of Des. I've written this up in detail. You know, I've got the documents and this and that.
That's what I like about. That's what I like about these 2 volumes. It's the backstory.
Taking you notice what I say. I try to be neutral, but obviously I can't be. But the documents are fascinating in themselves because you find out that, you know, the letter, for instance, by Hans Larendel in June 1980, where he's so supportive of Des, it shows you they weren't all against him. You know.
When we did
anyway, I've written it in much more, but Adrian, let me just mention Adrian. I don't know whether I can exactly remember it, but he was saying a planned continuation of Glacier View. So that's the point I wanted to make. The process was pre-planned, as Glacier View was. I've got witnesses who said Des was going to be fired. And the whole point of it was that, you know, they had a problem. They wanted to get rid of Des. They made it look as though they were being fair. Des wrote his book, which they didn't deal with the issues. They came up with a consensus, which Des was happy with. It said, I can live with this. It's not perfect, but, you know, it made some huge changes in his favour. But they came in with this 10-point statement. And the 10-point statement basically was based on the Dallas statement. And they said, we've got this statement of faith and we're not moving from it. And when he was judged on the Friday afternoon, they used a 10-point statement. So essentially, Des was judged by what the church taught traditionally. And that was it.
Yeah.
It's very hard to believe it, but when you follow the documents, you'll get it.
Yeah. And
I
I
don't know
think
whether I've explained that very well. There's a lot of
no,
stuff to go
you've
over.
explained it well, and like I said, in the 2 volumes, you can see it even more clearly. And
I mean,
where we played that website earlier, what's it called? The YouTube channel where all that material is? Is it just called Desmond Ford? I can't remember what the.
yes, and it's all put up by Phil Butler.
So if people want to go and just dig even deeper, they can go and research that. And I think, would you agree that the architect behind this kind of planned suppression and deletion of Des and his works, and you as well, was Neil Wilson and Pearson? Were they the 2 top players that were really going, this is what we want? Des is threatening the authority of Ellen White and the distinctive teaching of the investigative judgment. He's got to go. Let's make it happen. Were they the 2 main architects, do you think?
I find it very hard. I find it very hard to say because Pierce had moved off the scene. He was at Palmdale.
But
and
he'd written a lot to Wilson behind the scenes during Glacier View.
And the letter he wrote.
And they even read out the letter at Glacier View. I mean, there has to be an architect. What you're saying is it wasn't just an organic kind of thing. There was a plot to get rid of Des. And I'm just suggesting, and I might be wrong.
Well, the method.
But it seems to me that Neil Wilson was at the top of the list for being the architect.
It was an administrative method, and it was, Neil Wilson was very calm. He basically stated what he was. There's a very good article by Larry Geraghty where he verbally quotes Neil Wilson, and you get it very clear the church is not going to move. In the first meeting at Glacier View, he said so. He said, we're not going to move. We've got a statement. We're not going to change. This week, we're not going to change anything this week. And by the end of the week, everybody's got to agree. It's not going to be 50-50. And after that, Des and somebody needs, those meetings are recorded. And I'm going by memory, but Des and I looked at each other afterwards and said, well, he's told us. And then, of course, the making of the 10-point statement itself, which was done with 6 people, and then the screening committee took over and edited it, etc. But that was done, most of the scholars had no idea about. Even when Bill Johnson did his interview, he apparently, Len told him about the 10-point statement. He seemed to be totally unaware. And Fritz Guy and Larry Geraghty in their interview.
My interview with Norm Young was very revealing on that, because he was one of the 6, wasn't he, that was asked during the week of Glacier View to put together some points that clearly just demonstrated the differences that Des had with the church. So that's an interesting interview.
Yeah, I had a thought, and it sort of went out of my head. But Norman wrote a paper in 2006. Now that's something I could ask if I could put in volume 3, because it's a very important article.
Very important.
Where he talks about the history of that statement. He really didn't want to do it, and he said years later he wished he hadn't, because he was uncomfortable. He went to Jim Cox. He didn't find him much help, so he asked Des and said, better you than anybody else. So we never felt badly about Norman participating in that. He'd have done a good job. But that happened. And at the same time they were talking about us going to the new gallery. This came from Wally Scragg. Wally Scragg had actually met with us at the time of Dallas, and it was a strange meal. I didn't know him at all, but he was Des's friend. he talked about how liberal he was. He didn't like Ellen White's books. He liked Derek Dennett's commentary. He was a contemporary of Ellen White. It was, and he said, in Europe, we don't have these problems. And afterwards I said to Des, he's going to try and get you out of this. He's going to offer you a job. Well, he was the president in Europe. Definitely talk about Des going to the new gallery, as Russell Kranz had been earlier, and being the evangelist. Now, what happened with that? That got thrown out in the third Prexad meeting, when, you know, which was padded with people, and they said Des is too much of a heretic to go anywhere. But I've just been working on a letter this week that I wrote on August the 26th, 1980, to Ken and Eleanor Barrett. And in that, it's very clear that it's up and down. Are we going to England or not? And I want to know immediately, because Luke's got to start make a decision. So it wasn't, you know, that was talked about on the floor at Glacier View. And so when the Prexad meeting took place on the Friday, a lot of the people at Heaven's Door had left. A lot of people left on the Thursday night. And when they suddenly heard that Des had been fired, because I came out, and there's a question about that. I was told that I was emotional and I exaggerated, but Des said before he died, no, you didn't. He said it was decided. And the Review and Herald, before Des was fired, variant views discarded, or something like that, basically saying the decision was made on the Friday afternoon, which is the idea I got, because they talked about severance, going back, and I'd give you, Parmenter said, I'd give you a job in the SHF, but I know it wouldn't suit you. He actually said that to Des. I was there. So I thought he'd been fired. But you see, it's all to do with procedure. And procedurally, they couldn't do it. It had to go through these various committees. But it was as done as it could be.
It had been done, but not dusted.
Nobody said to me, don't talk about this outside the committee. And I came out, and Fred Veltman said to me, well, what happened? I said, well, Des got fired, or I don't know. Fred said I said something different, but my memory is I said, oh, he got fired. And then I got told off. The only time, I might add, that Parmenter actually spoke to me personally. And I got told off for being emotional and misrepresenting things. And I said, but I thought that's what happened.
Yeah. And you weren't misrepresenting. You might have been misrepresenting the procedure where the last nail hadn't gone in the coffin yet, but certainly the lid had been placed on firmly.
I've got a letter.
Sorry?
Well, just let me finish this then. I've got a letter from Vern Parmenter to Arthur Patrick. And it's not, he's basically sneering Arthur. But the good thing about that letter, which is not supposed to be shared, is that... Is
it in either of the volumes?
He's quoting... No. Anyway, that for, because I'm nearly finished.
Sorry, go. Yeah, you were saying what was in the letter from Vern to Arthur, and he was kind of being a little bit condescending.
Oh, it's...
So Vern wrote a letter to Arthur?
Patrick? Yeah, but what was I talking about before? So momentous.
Yeah, we need to rewind and play back. It's the sign. We've both got
you have to wait for
sinusitis.
the third book. That's the reason it's not coming out.
Yeah, I shouldn't have interrupted the flow. Sorry.
Oh, that's all. And I might suddenly remember it anyway.
What was the letter from Vern to Arthur? What was the gist of it?
Oh, it was in 2006 when it was particularly Milton, but they had done a 25th anniversary of Glacier View, and they wrote it up for Spectrum. And I think that Milton had put a paper in Adventist Today. And of course, he said that Parmenter went to Glacier View with dagger in hand. And Vern took offence at this. And so they received a number of things. I won't go into detail on that, complaining about it, and that the whole idea that John Brinsmead had biased Parmenter by telling him stuff about Des and Bob being in cahoots. But the problem with that is that whatever they say, Claude Judd was in the meeting, and it's sort of recorded that he was. And Bob Brinsmead told me all about the situation. So I think it did happen. Anyway.
Well,
I was talking about going to the new gallery. So what happens is we go in there, and it's pretty clear Des wasn't going to resign, and he didn't resign, but he couldn't go along with these requirements of Parmenter, and Parmenter was adamant, and he really had the same approach as Wilson, that if you can't teach the fundamentals, you should hand in your credentials. A number of people who wrote that 10-point statement couldn't have signed it themselves. So
yeah, that's right. Well,
yeah.
that's a poignant.
So that's how
thing
they
to
got
say
it.
there.
You know, look, Des didn't want to leave, and nor did I. And even though, you know, we've been out of the church, we did go to church in 2017 for a while. But it's awkward when you've been declared apostate. It doesn't make you feel very comfortable being in there. But will the Adventists?
I wonder not only those 6, but I wonder of the many academics and scholars that were at Glacier View, how many of them could have signed off on the 10-point.
No.
I just want to put up something here and refer to something John Rosier said to me in the interview the other night. So this is a Facebook user. Unfortunately, I can't, when it comes on Restream, it just says Facebook user, so I can't identify who actually said it. Jill, the church missed the best and maybe the last opportunity to correct its doctrinal errors. Des' works will benefit people who are interested in the true gospel, whereas those who just defend the church no matter what, well, there is no hope. I've gone off the screen. There is, where did that go? Those who just defend the church, well, there is no hope for them. The official church will never change its position. This is my prophecy, says the person. Now, when I interviewed John Rosier, which I think was the one just before this one, episode 14, he mentions that in his study, there have been 6 times in the Adventist Church's history where this kind of Glacier View moment has happened, where the inaccuracies and falsehoods of the investigative judgment, if I may be so bold as to say that, have been raised. He talked about 1888, I think 1890, 1919, 1997, sometime in the 60s, 70s, and then finally the last one was Glacier View. But each time it has been raised, a similar thing has happened where the information has been squashed. Ellen White's authority has been challenged, and those who have challenged her have been suppressed, fired, whatever. And I said to John, well, that's 42 years ago now. That's the longest gap between any kind of rising up again to try and correct the issues and bring Adventism more into alignment with the gospel. Do you think that there will be another Glacier View where the church has an opportunity to address this, or do you think it is over? Or will there be a seventh time and seventh time lucky? Just personally, what do you think?
Well, I was thinking, I don't feel badly about Mentor or Wilson at all. In fact, I've got a letter here, the letter that Wilson, it is in the book, wrote to us after the meetings in 1983. And I think it's worth reading if we've got time to do it, but I can do it another day. But
can you read that
the
now?
old story. Yeah, but it's the old story of new wine in old wineskins. Adventism, because of its setup, like most organisations, the gospel is just too powerful, and it bursts the bag.
Mm.
Anyway, let me read it.
Yeah, go ahead, read it.
You may not see in what I do, but one of the reasons I want to read it is because, Gilbert Valentine just came through. I keep in touch with him. He's got all my records, and they're very good friends. And he thinks I'm too hard. Now, I do think there's a form of trickery by the way things are done that's hidden behind the scenes, that I had to find all this out. Nobody tells you anything.
And he thinks you're too harsh on what?
Right. He thinks I'm too hard on Neil Wilson, although I don't think I'm particularly hard. But he's thinking of an article that I wrote that I've rewritten. It took me about 3 years. I had it, and I'd get all the things he said to me, so I did soften it down. But I think about it because, Gil's a good student and he's very honest. Anyway, dear Desmond, I find no pleasure at all in writing this letter to you, for I still hold you and Jill in deep Christian regard and will continue to do so. It is only fair, however, that I pass on to you the decision of the General Conference officers after receiving the Millbrae, California, with the General Conference Group, January 14 to 17, 1983. Our brethren reported on the cordial atmosphere and the spirit of Christian fellowship which prevailed at the meetings. They also gave a clear picture of your attitudes and the love you feel towards the church. And its people, and your appreciation of its fellowship. I was particularly anxious to see if there were which we could build to heal the wounds, amend the breaches, and come together so as to bring about full restoration and fellowship with the church, which you have publicly professed to be a part of. As you know, there were many who did not fully share those concerns, but I felt we should proceed. In giving thought to the personnel of the committee, I had in mind men who would listen and patiently discuss the issues. In the choice of topic, the concern was to be able to assess, and as early as possible, whether we could move to understanding. The counsel which the Lord has given the church leadership in at least one part doctrinal issues was that unless there is ground to hope for coming together, long discussions are not helpful to either side. From the report our brethren have brought, and they are unanimous in their views, our approaches and presuppositions, yours as the GM group and ours at the GC, in the area of eschatology, understanding of prophecy, are far apart, even further apart than was the case at the time of the Glacier meeting. We believe from the remarks reported to us that you see this as clearly as do our brethren who were with you. This being the case, it is clear to us that no constructive purpose will be served by further study sessions. Even in a case like the 45 BC date, which you suggested as a topic for study, you and we would come with the same presuppositions and approaches we now have. The position you have taken in regard to meeting its fulfillment in the 1st century and having no meaning beyond New Testament times, except as reinterpreted by the New Testament, is so radically different that it will divide us on almost every point of eschatology and prophetic interpretation. We do not judge your sincerity or your Christianity. Our quarrel is not with you, but with what you are teaching. It is unhappily divisive and confusing to many, and we are left with no alternative but to advise the Australasian Division to proceed to deal with your case as a minister of the Church as seems best. I repeat that I find no pleasure in this. I feel nothing but the deepest sorrow and regret, and wish with all my heart things could have been otherwise. In doing what we feel bound to do, we do not want to cut off communication with you. You and Jill are still persons, precious people, whom I love in Jesus Christ. May the love of Christ constrain you, and may his providence lead and guide you in all your future plans and decisions. With kind regards to you, Jill, and each of your colleagues, I am sincerely your brother. It's a pretty great letter.
Who wrote that again?
That was Neil Wilson.
Wow.
When
was that written?
After the meetings in 1983, when they proceeded. By February, we'd had letters saying that. Now, the interesting thing is, if you read the policy from Manila, being called apostate is part of it, but it was never mentioned specifically in the reports. I think that people would have objected if they'd said Des was an apostate, but it's in the policy.
Right.
And it's after that, and I had not made the connection that they started going, but Jack Castle, in an interview, a written interview with Trevor Lloyd, mentions that this is when it started. And he also mentioned that Wally Scragg was the person who came up with the idea of the new gallery, which I'd always thought, because of the meal we'd had with him, but I had no documentary evidence. So it's like putting little pieces together. So you have to take into account this, it's a very lovely letter. And he was always very nice to me. But on the other account, if you read the article of Adrian Zakot, he talks about it's amazing that he was watching and he saw this. He's dead now. And of course, very, very clever man. He was the person who called the forum with Wayne Judd.
Right.
But he wrote this amazing article, and just for me, because I needed it for my books, and I didn't know it existed. And he talks about this, and what I've told you is the conclusion that he came to. So June 1983, Spectrum has a beautiful article too, but it's about how this sort of treatment, apostatizing people, what it does to the congregation. So
look.
So you've got to take this into account, the front story, the way you get dealt with and what you get told, and the backstory that it's all planned.
That's right. And you're mentioning Gil Valentine there.
There's no, because Des said to Neil Wilson, he said, I won't meet. The Good News men were willing to not have any meetings in Australia. I was amazed because none of them were employed by the church anymore. They'd all been treated badly. But they, you know, for the sake of a possible good, they said they wouldn't have any meetings. Of course, they ended up doing it because they'd been fired. But anyway, another track I've gone down. I've forgotten. What do you want to say, Julian?
Well, I was just going to say, you mentioning Gil Valentine and his latest book, Ostriches and Canaries, Coping with Change in Adventism from 1966 to 1979. I can't wait till that's on Kindle so that I can actually get a copy of it. I think it will be very soon. For some reason, Amazon won't send it to me from the States. But anyway, my point is that when I've read that, I think you and I have chatted that Gil might come on the show and we can chat about the book. And I'm very interested in his views on the leadership and from maybe even a sociological perspective of why they seem to react like they do regarding these politics and protectionist measures to keep the faith a certain way.
Gil is you know, as a historian, he what's the word? Neutral.
Yeah.
And he states the facts, but he's not judgmental.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
You know, and as I say, I've had to look again at my attitude about Neil Wilson, and I don't, in my heart, feel anything personal towards Parmenter and Neil Wilson. I mean, after all, it's their job to take care of the church. But I was going to say about the unity thing that when Des was at Avondale, Eric Magnuson said they never had. Now, the old men said that students came out disaffected, but I don't think it was true. There was Jeff Jordan, of course, but he was exceptional in his antagonism towards Des. And the same thing at PUC. Castle never had any trouble with Des. So the division came from the opposition to Des. And of course, it started way back in the you know, in the 50s when Des was a student and worked with Burnside. And some of those men, there were good people among them, but as Des said to me, some of them were barely Christian.
Yeah.
And they were cause of the division. And you know, when Gil did his talk recently, I listened to him on Adventist Today or Spectrum, and he's talking about Colin Standish and Russell Standish, and in their papers, a lot of the stuff they said was absolutely untrue. Des was often, people would send him what the Standish brothers wrote, and he would write to them and threaten to sue them. Now, this was funny because he wouldn't have sued them, but he would use his son-in-law name as his lawyer, and occasionally they would put a retraction in, like they would say things like Des supported homosexuality, and he supported homosexuals. You know, he was extremely sympathetic, but they put a nasty thing on it.
And I think
about that was
there's
they
lots
did
of
put in a retraction. They didn't want to get sued, but then when Russell died, his widow, published it again.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Now, I just want to see a bit of an experiment here. I'm just seeing if I can share and if people can still hear my voice. Can you see that on your screen and still hear me?
More.
That's just just showing the ostriches and canaries and just noting that your book is already showing quite high here in customers who bought the canaries also have been buying Glacier View Volume 1 and 2 there. So that's good. And they've also bought books
there haven't been many sales.
There's also been books like Wayne Judd's In Motion, My Stories, which I'd be an interesting read. But yeah, I just thought I'd do that to give a little plug as well for both your book and also for ostriches and canaries as well. Now,
Well,
we're
according to
coming to a
my records, I've sold 18 of each. And I'm not interested whether it sells or not. I'm happy to have,
Yeah.
I've sent out more than that myself and paid
Yeah.
for it from the Ford family money to have it out there. That's all I'm concerned about. I want to have, I don't care whether you buy it or not. I am in the happy position where
It's so important that it's out there. It's like that's why I have this urgency to get season 2 out on YouTube. So that's not at the moment. It's only available in our Facebook private group, and it's difficult to access. You have to kind of scroll down, and I'm working on a project that I'm calling the Des Ford Project, where I'm hoping people can help contribute and help me get these out there on YouTube. Now,
this is a card thanking me for that book by somebody high up in the church.
Isn't that great? And that makes it worthwhile. Now, I'm wanting to go
Mind you, I
to
sent it.
questions. I'm wanting to go to questions and comments. So those that are watching, now's your time to ask Gillian any questions, because they are often delayed coming through to me on my screen. So now's the time. And then we're going to close with Gillian. I'd love you to get volume 1 open there, Gillian. And I'm going to get you to read the first paragraph a little bit later for us. But let's go to a couple of questions that have come through and comments. And then we're going to wrap up today. And I think we'll definitely be getting you back though, Gillian. I always enjoy having you on our program.
Don't say anything mean. I've been sick.
No one will say anything mean. No one does. I've really enjoyed, I mean, how many, myself and you and sometimes Milton and John Rosier on our Inside Scoop Facebook sort of subscription group, which has been a little bit left hanging like recently, but I'll be getting back to it. We had how many interviews there with us going very in depth, and that's where I first got to see a lot of these documents that I see you now have put in these books. So that's been fabulous as well. Okay, so this one, I do know this is from my wonderful mother. So she's asked you a question. Amazing detail, with more and more SDAs questioning the sanctuary doctrine, many just keep quiet. And with so much more information becoming available, what does Gillian think will happen in the future regarding the church? It's already becoming very divided. Now, I know you said earlier that you believe the gospel will always shine through, but I think my mother, Heather Dixon, is asking what you think is going to happen with the church in the future regarding this topic.
Well, Heather, I've got no idea. I've got to say, you know, when we left and there was this great furore, a group in Auburn, California, set up GNU. But I was thinking about it recently. I was thinking we really should have talked first, because they had a different agenda, and their agenda was very similar. You know, Bob Brinsmead had already started the idea of congregationalism, and churches were already splitting, and Des didn't want to go that way. And when Smuts came, nor did he, because he said the tyranny of is even worse than the tyranny of the hierarchy. Think about that. So we sort of half the board left fairly early on. I don't know how long it was. They set the thing up, but then Des wouldn't do what they wanted. He wouldn't.
That's interesting.
No, he wouldn't badmouth Ellen White. What was the other thing? And he wouldn't go against the Sabbath.
See, in my view, I thought you and he had started Good News Unlimited, and it was your baby. But what you're saying is that it was started by others, and you were you on the board? Were you contributing writers?
No, I wasn't on the board. I was actually running the office very badly. You know, I can do all the all the brochures and all that sort of stuff, but I knew nothing about accounting. We were getting money in, but they got the Kimes, Dr. and Mrs. Kime in California, and Don and Vesta Moose. He was the artist, and they were both on the board of Verdict.
Oh,
Now,
right.
that did create some problems.
Yeah.
And I can sort of see that it was never because they wanted to go with Congregationalism, and Des didn't want to split the church. He really didn't. So, but Vesta Moose's sister-in-law, Marion Fritz, came along. She took over and ran the office, did a lot more better job than I did. So it was, and then the history of all the congregations, there's been very few that have been successful. And I won't remember the names, but of course, Richard Fredericks has been very successful, and there are others. Most of them just...
By congregations, you mean GNU kind of gatherings?
As a hub of all the
Yes.
congregations. So
Right, okay.
not only do I have an experience of Glacier View, I have an experience of the idea of Congregationalism. And one of the problems that I see, and there's nothing wrong with these people at all, it was they should have taught more at the beginning that about what their aims were, because Des was never on that wavelength.
Right.
You know, right or wrong. There are a lot of people on the ex-Adventist things, I don't read it, but I'm told, as a lot of people are about Ellen White, because he didn't go all the way. But a lot of people who leave, they become very bitter, and it's just not Christian. I mean, they keep the judgmentalism that they had in Adventism, and you know, if you're going to, and this is one of the problems, that you tend to draw people who are on the edge. You know, I was noticing on the advert that you did this morning, somebody came on, was crazy. And I thought how unfortunate it is that it's associated with your site. So same sort of thing would happen again. The church has this, that the sort of people who are traditional are also well organised, know how to run things, and so on. And people who come up with the ideas, they're often not terribly practical, and so it doesn't work. I don't know whether I'm making any sense, but
no, I think that's good. And I think one of the things I've noticed, and why I think SDAQ&A has been quite successful, is that a lot of people feel you have to gather around a group of beliefs that you all agree upon, whereas I'm more about a lot of people gathering around and sharing a variety of beliefs. So instead of gathering around a fire of similar beliefs, I'm gathering a variety of beliefs around a fire where you get to dialogue that. And so that's why I'm more open to accepting the crazies and I can't think of another group that has this kind of diversity within it, where there are full-on fundamentalists, incredible scholars and academics, all contributing. When we have an interview, we're speaking to a vast cross-section of Adventists and former Adventists, and it's a unique kind of group. Now, let's go on to another one here. This might be more of a comment. The sooner will the SDA Church break into more than two parts and confess the unbiblical character of the investigative judgment and its ingredients, it will continue to soften up this doctrine so that it may look more appealing, but it will not give up on it. It cannot. Unfortunately, its historic justification for existence is in the heart of this doctrine and not in the gospel of Christ. And I think Glacier View really was all about challenging the investigative judgment, Des's view that it wasn't biblically sound. So I don't know if you want to comment on that or not.
That's what he went there for. that
That's
was
right.
the idea. He went.
Yeah, yeah. And it seems, as John Rosier said, every time that it has been raised in the 6 times that he's identified, the same outcome has occurred.
And Des always said, I was born to go to Glacier View, which Milton Hook said to me, he thought Des was convinced of it. And the stars, I'm not, this is just saying.
Metaphorically.
The fact that I'm not saying that Naden, well, of course, the one I mentioned, Sibley, understood the problems. I'm not saying that because before Parmenter you've got Naden and Frame. I'm not saying that they would have coped really well with Des suddenly coming up with the October Forum. But the fact that Elder Parmenter came in, who was he was traditional. So he essentially, after we went to America, they had 3 meetings with the Concerned Brethren in the 70s. And in the end, Frame had said that the men, Des went down for the last one, he had a suitcase, and he went to the railway station, he went down to Sydney with a huge suitcase of books, which were denominational books. So everything they brought up, he had the books. He said, I'm not teaching anything that's not taught in the American. That was how he defended himself. And in the end, Frame said to the old men, well, he basically said they haven't kept up with their reading. That's how they did it. And he said, you've had 3 goes, and the last meeting he invited all the departmental heads in as well. So it was quite a big meeting. Des was exonerated each time he was there to defend himself. And Frome said, that's it, you can't do it anymore. So in 1976, Frome wants to get out because it's getting too hot. Not Frame. And in comes Elder Parmenter. And he had meetings with Standish brother, Russell Standish's book, The Gathering Storm, which you used to be able to conveniently read online. And one meeting they had, I can't remember the number because I'm hopeless with numbers, but it was over 100. It may have been nearly 200 of these retired men met with Parmenter. And Des wasn't there to defend himself. So you get a change of guard, and you have to look. We took that as a providence, the Glacier View, because to some degree we accepted what happened back then was Parmenter coming in. And he was always, in his letters, he was, polite and everything, but, the putting, promising Des that he would go back to Avondale, and then a year after he went to America, and 2 years before Glacier View, he sends a letter saying, you're not coming back to Avondale, you're going out into the field or into evangelism. He didn't give him a specific job, but he did that under pressure. And Des, I've never seen Des angry, but he did feel betrayed by that because he made the decision after telling workers in Australia. This is in October 1978, 2 years before Glacier View. And essentially, when Des knew he would be taken out of teaching, if you come back to Australia, you're going to stay on it in America. His professional life was over at that point. And he said that when he came to Glacier View, the way it led on, he didn't initiate it. He felt he had nothing to lose. So that was sort of the first thing. So Parmenter's a big factor. And then the thing with John Brinsmead, now largely by what Bob Brinsmead's told me, it caused a huge, when he wrote 1844 Re-Examined, it caused a huge ruction between him and his brother. And his brother went down and talked to Claude Judd, and Claude Judd took him to see Parmenter. Now, this was before or around June 1978, and probably led to Des being pulled out of Avondale. And, you know, I'm telling you what I know. Bob tells me, he's told me, even talked to his brother about it now. So I think it happened. Vern Parmenter said it never did. But Claude Judd said he was in the meeting. So, but anyway, the fact of that happening, that John Brinsmead, and it's not that they ever spoke to me, but when we got to Glacier, and of course we'd been in America, so we never heard the rumours. Graham Bradford heard the rumours and said they went all around Australia. And Eric Magnuson questioned me about it after Glacier View for about 4 hours, asking me about my
what rumour
contact
was
with
this? That you had what?
That I was the mediator. I could say that he wasn't in contact with Bob because
colluding with Bob, right?
I was the mediator,
right?
You know, it wasn't. Yeah. It wasn't true at all.
Yeah,
and that I was calling Bob.
Des makes that clear in the clip we played at the beginning too, doesn't he?
Yeah, so we get to Glacier View, and this is all around the floor that Bob is either in the building or he's close by. And I was phoning people. Now I was phoning probably Calvin Edwards, the Kimes. I know, but I never called Bob. I never called Australia. I was accused of calling Australia on the Tuesday, but we didn't. In those days, you didn't call Australia.
And wasn't like having devices like today.
But they're watching me make
and there's a part of me that thinks, so what as well? So what if you did? I know I'm not saying you did. I know you didn't, but I'm also like, so what? Hey, that I put up it was a funny comment earlier. I'll just quickly put up again. For God so loved the world, he didn't send a committee.
So this is number 2 of John Brinsmead should get upset, and that he should say this about Des, and it was believed, because on the Friday afternoon at Prexad, even though I've got the notes of the brethren, I shouldn't have them, but I've had them for years, right. And they don't mention this, but Parmenter, and I wasn't at all the meeting, but when I came in, Brinsmead was a big factor. Now remember, Parmenter never, and in that meeting at Prexad, they never asked me about my contact with Bob, but I was part of the rumour. Right. See, so we don't know what's all this about John Brinsmead. Right. So we thought to ourselves, the chances of that happening, you know, we saw it as a providence. Which people may find strange, but that's how we interpret it. The fact that Parmenter came in, the fact of John Brinsmead, and he knew Parmenter from Queensland, and because this was a big factor, Des's relationship, and of course, we were used to being gossiped about. We used to laugh about it. All sorts of things went around. There's mowing on the Sabbath. We heard that on several continents. Number one, you couldn't drive past our place. It was on top of a hill. You'd have to come onto the property. Number two, we didn't have a lawn. Number three, we didn't have a lawnmower. What was the other one? And when we did mow the lawn, it was Luke who did it, not Des. But the rumour went around. Rumours, you know, a lot of them are not true. But you
people love attacking the player, not the ball. It's a known way to bring down an argument. A successful way to bring down an argument is to attack the person. The ad hominem attack works, sadly. Those little rumours and things make people go, oh, I've heard he's mowing the lawn on the Sabbath. That's how far he's fallen. And hundreds of people hear that rumour, and it's terrible that people stoop that low. Okay, let's keep going.
So number one, Parmenter. Number two, the John Brinsmead thing. And then Bob comes out with 1844 re-examined,
Right.
where he challenges 1844. And Des is going around the country answering questions, and all that asking questions. What is going to, what's he going to do? He has to answer it. He feels the church has got to answer it. They often never do. Then he goes to Washington, D.C. Oh, no, then in June, he's given 3 months off to write Crisis, which wasn't published for a few years because obviously his books were all shredded. Like the commentary on Daniel was only published for 2 years and then shredded.
Mm.
So he went for a Righteousness by Faith meeting, must have been in early October in 1979, Library of Congress. And as I told you, he goes into the stacks and he comes to this realization that Adventists did in the 19th century what churches who used historicism did all through the ages. They read the book of Revelation like a newspaper and they applied it to their times with some very strange interpretations. And after time, it was nonsense till the next people came along and did the same thing. So that was another providence. And then he's asked to take this meeting at the Forum. And Zukowski and Judd say to him, "You'll be fine, Forum." And it's true that many strange meetings have been taken by people who work for the church for Forum, and it never was a problem before. So Des gets up and he's saying, here are the problems. And then he comes and he says, here are some answers. Now, the problems were known and his solutions, the scholars basically turned their nose up at them, but he did make an attempt to say, look, we can get around this by, interpreting it this way. So he's asked to do it. And of course, there are people in the audience. And they thought, usually you might get 100 go to Forum. And on the day, it was to be held in the music hall. And on the day, almost 1,000 people turn up. And of course, there's not enough room there because of the drums and everything in there. So they suddenly put it up in Irwin Hall, right up on the top of the hill, and you got to go. There's 1,000 people run up the hill. I was there. It's an amazing experience. So it became, a big deal, which they didn't expect. Because then, nobody will come out for this. You got to love him. And then, of course, they called him out of class. He wasn't allowed to do his exams. And they came down on him fairly soon. And it was absolutely devastating for Wayne Judd. And Adrian, if you read his book that you mentioned, he never taught Sabbath school or preached again. And look, wow. Wayne was the most wonderful person. I can't tell you what he was like. And the students loved him. He was just full of life. And one thing that you should read, I'm going to put it in volume 3, if Spectrum will let me, is the interview of Adrian Zukowski with Des after Glacier View and his attitude towards the brethren. There's something, I wouldn't mind reading you some of these documents at other times. Because
we should do a reading document interview.
There's a lot of
now we're going to just do some rapid fire, quick question, quick answer, quick comment, and some we may not need to comment on. The SDA Church needs to be split into 1,000 pieces and cast into the wind. Someone else has written, so Neil Wilson did all what he did, then wrote a nice, lovely letter. The letter was absolutely no value. It's mere hypocrisy.
See, I don't see that. I don't see that. But the thing was, they were never going to change. They weren't going
Yeah,
to change.
yeah. I think, I don't think the church is going to change, and there's many, as in this question / comment may highlight what we're saying. Actually, I don't think that church is really divided at all, at least not consciously so. The vast majority, way over 90%, are from the global south and firmly in the fundamentalist end of the spectrum, and the majority of the rest don't care. I know that's sad to hear, but I believe that to be the truth. And that might be
well, I
true.
think preach the gospel, and you know what happens. Of course, I'm getting old, so it needs somebody else. And one of my purposes, we haven't talked about why I wrote the books. Number one, I wanted to have something from our point of view. Number two, I wanted to tell people what Des was like, so that in volume 2 there's a whole lot of testimonials at the back, and also what he thought. So there's a few position papers I found of Des's on the goal and so forth. But I've done this, the historians and researchers of the future, so that, you know, they'll find it pretty easy to find the material they need. That's the main purpose, because I do have, you know, I've got a master's in history. I'd like to have done a PhD, but Des got sick. But I've written a number of history books. I'm not even sure. I'm waving them around here. Oh,
Hold
it's all
them
right.
still.
My screen is stuck. Thomas Cartwright has had a lot of work done by me, and a man called John Manningham. They both wrote diaries in the 60s. So that's where I cut my teeth on doing historical research.
Someone has commented how they value that there's no bitterness coming from you at all. Thanks, Gillian.
Well, I've sort of worked it out.
Mm.
That's one reason for doing all this work. I get my moments, but we had a good life. You know, people, they didn't treat us any differently. Wherever we went, we've received open arms and a lot of love from Adventists.
I remember when you both I remember when you and Elaine and Des came down to do that morning and afternoon program for me in Kurrambong, in the church in the trees there. And we had 350 people in the morning and 330 in the afternoon. And the love for you guys was just electric in the room. You could just tell. So I even remember thinking then that you probably were receiving that kind of love wherever you went. So there's some good things that, like you say, you had a good life.
Des said to me, all the good news, the GNU meetings, people were so happy to fellowship together wherever we went.
Someone else has written.
Really got nothing to complain about.
Has Adventism today accepted the gospel as proposed by Des Ford? That's an interesting one. I know many years ago I would have probably said, yeah, they probably have. But in recent times, I think that's falling away. It's found, and I guess that means righteous by faith and assurance of salvation. In pockets, it's everywhere. It's there, I should say. But by and large, I think it's regressed.
My screen is still...
we can see you. You're moving around nicely.
Oh, that's okay. The problem with the gospel, with Adventism, is that we still largely teach Wesleyan sanctification, which involves sanctification in the judgment. And because of this, most of it isn't the gospel of righteousness by faith in the book of Romans and Galatians. You teach righteousness by faith, and Gerhardt, well, even Neil Wilson said, we're glad that this issue wasn't about righteousness by faith. They're so sure that they're preaching what Des did, but they are not.
No, that's right.
And people, like George Knight, he says, well, in Corinthians, and there's a point to this, Paul says we've all got to stand before the judgment throne of God. But really this talk would stand on its own, and John Rosie should come in, or somebody like Milton, because they understand this exactly. People who helped me in a phenomenal... Sorry, I've got to blow my nose. Excuse me.
That's all right. People have been very helpful, and people like John and Milton are great at articulating what happened. People like Lyndon Rogers, Andrew Skeggs, my interviews with them in season 2, I really admired how clearly they could
I've got what I
frame the
call
whole thing.
the horsemen of the apolismatic. I have a number of people who really know their stuff, and John Rosier is one of them. Eli Gonzalez, Glenn Hansen in China. You don't know who he is. He's an English language teacher, but he understands the gospel very, very well. Fleetwood Mac, he comes from a ministry family and was in the ministry and left over Glacier View. When you get to talking to him on the details, he's phenomenally knowledgeable. And then I've got people like Kylie Burling who helped me with proofing, and she's just remarkable. So I'm very, very fortunate. Like in these books, I sort of organize articles and I asked people to write them, and they did. And I'm getting a couple of people to write stuff for volume 3. So I know in my head what I want to do, and I'm very fortunate to have people to help me. Another person who's been a phenomenal help is Ray Smith, who also is extremely knowledgeable about the gospel and the church issues. But he also has scanned a number of books for me. Because he knows what he's doing, it makes, like, he's just done Des's Manchester thesis to work on, and I'm going to do an index for it. Big job.
A big job. We're going to wrap it up in a minute. I'm having to miss a lot of these comments and questions, but I encourage everyone, if you're watching on YouTube, go and click the link to join the Facebook group. It's a private group, and you can join in the conversation there. Ongoing, we just leave the interviews up. People often comment for weeks and weeks. Go and enjoy the conversation there. Someone else asked me, is there a kind of a list of upcoming meetings and whatnot? No, we're very kind of random. I usually do go live 11:30 Thursday mornings, Australian time, Sydney time, New South Wales. There's usually an interview every week there. And for some reason, notifications on YouTube are not working properly. I don't know. We'll have to look at that. Another question, would it be a good historical study to contrast the parallels between Wagner Jones in 1888 and Ford and Brinsmead in 79-80? That's an interesting one. I'm not sure if you have thoughts on that.
It is an interesting one, but I'd say no, because I don't think what was going on, I think, I'm getting blocked. Just hang on a minute. I need to drink of water.
While you're having a drink there, someone's asked me, Peter Dixon, can you please ask Jill this question? It only comes up saying Facebook user, so it's hard for me to see what the thread is there. And even on my iPad, I think it's Joe Pizzolato said, righteous by faith like Luther taught. Peter, can you please ask Jill this question? I'm not sure what that means there. Maybe pop something there so we can unpack that a bit more. So just back to what...
there's two things there that I'd like to answer. But Wagner and Jones. Now, there's differences of opinion on this. Marty Webber's done quite a bit of work on what he taught, and the thought is that at the best he was teaching that Jesus in you keeps the law. So it wasn't really the gospel faith. It was, and the Ellen White, although she wrote some very good things about justification, that because of her Wesleyanism, she sort of ended up with Jesus in you keeps the law. So she still has these statements that are worrying, even in the 1890s. There is somebody else who's writing a book on Ellen White and the gospel, who's really good on the subject, having trouble getting it published, but he's on this, and he's the person who really ought to talk about it. That's all I'll say about that. But it said here, somebody says, Tom Norris stated on the recent SDAQ&A interview that the gospel is difficult to understand. I don't think it is, but I think that it's so simple. And the essence of it is that we are justified not by works of law, but by faith in Christ. And it's a completely different method than we think. So it's not, I think probably I should, that we're actually saved without the law at all. Only Christ's keeping of the law put to our account stands for anything, but I'm not explaining it very well.
No, I think you are. And I think Eliezer Gonzalez has just written something. We'll just put that up. This will be our last couple of points here. Thank you, Eliezer. I've enjoyed my interviews with him as well very much. I think Jones and Wagner were on the right track, but still mixed up with regard to the role of imparted righteousness. I think that God has periodically raised up people to highlight the gospel to the SDA Church, and every time they were rejected, Jones and Wagner were part of that, and so was Des with Greater Light. And he adds, so yes, Jill, the simplicity of the gospel is offensive to our carnal nature. It's the offense of the cross.
Adventists get, because of these texts like in Corinthians and Romans, where Paul said we all have to stand before the judgment throne of God. They sort of shift righteousness by faith to the background. So you've got to explain both. But really, if you have accepted Christ as your Saviour, based on Christ's works alone, then you don't face judgment like the wicked. You basically have a path to go through the judgment, and the judgment for the Christian is more about rewards than punishment. I'm not making that sense.
No, you are. Well, we're going to end it there. We've got a Facebook saying they are grateful for this interview. Thank you. Someone else has said, you are explaining it very simply and very well, Jill. Now, while I just give a quick plug for 2 future shows, can you just get the preface of Volume 1? I want you to close with you reading that first paragraph there. What was Des like? I think it's you've summed up a really nice in that first paragraph. But before you read that, just a quick plug. I am in negotiations with John Rosier to have our third interview, which is a kind of a little 3-parter that we've been doing about Ted Wilson. His Adventism, is it yours, is the question we've asked. And they've been very good interviews. And I think we may be going again for Monday night, 8 o'clock New South Wales Sydney time. And
Oh, that'd be
also,
great.
I've just been chatting at the very wee hours of the morning with the Naked Pastor, the famous guy that does lots of cartoons. And he is going to be doing an interview with me on, let me just quickly check that. I think Wednesday morning, the 21st of September, 9:30 a.m. Sydney, New South Wales time. That is going to be a fascinating interview as well. So put that in your diary if you're a fan of the Naked Pastor. Have you seen his work at all, Gillian?
I think I might have occasionally.
He has funny kind of stick figure cartoons of Jesus and sheep and church buildings, and he's very thought-provoking. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining in today and being a part of this amazing conversation with Gillian Ford. I highly recommend that you go and buy this book on Amazon, On the Way to Glacier View. That's volume 1 and volume 2. And they're fantastic, really incredible books that offer resources that I don't think have been seen in the one place. This is an incredible amount of work you've done, Gillian, and greatly valued. Yeah, well done. And people, go and support
Thank you.
Gillian's hard work. Go and buy this book. So, Gillian, if you could have the last word, and what was Des like in the preface there? Read us that first paragraph.
This is going to be hard. I knew Desmond Ford for 53 years. I was married to him for 49. When I met him and his wife Gwen the first time, I thought them the most innocent people I'd ever met. I've never lost my respect for that good and great couple whose sole interest was presenting Christ and the gospel. Des had a happy and even disposition. He was full of faith, full of the gospel, intense and energetic like a whirlwind. There was nothing nasty and nothing mean in him. He understood God's forgiveness. He preached it to those who were starved and hungry. He also believed that those who'd been forgiven much must forgive their brethren. And I had a front row seat in just how he did this. I never met anybody like Des. He was never jealous. He rejoiced in the good. He rejoiced in the success and prosperity of others. He was wise and sagacious. He was a Christian with exceptional gifts. Many other people treated him as a person of no repute.
Well said. Thank you, Gillian. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and look forward to catching up with you again soon, Gillian. We'll do another one very soon. And hope your cold gets better. See you next time, everyone.
So do I. Bye-bye.